spent 7 years in the Bush administration working on Iraq and Afghanistan. I currently teach in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Harvard University, and I couldn't think of a better way to serve at this time of my life than to teach. I'm no longer making decisions about national security myself, but every year I'm teaching dozens of people and hoping that they're a little better positioned to do what I used to do, and that to me is still serious service. I came to the Kennedy School after more than 6 years in government, where I had been working intensively on Iraq and Afghanistan. I had spent a cumulative almost 2 years in Iraq and most of the rest of that time at the White House working for President Bush. And so I thought, well, what are the things that I can really bring to Kennedy School students that they can't get from others, or they're unlikely to get from others? And I came up with 2 answers. The first is that I have insight or knowledge into countries and crises that are very important to the United States and to the international community, and those countries being Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course, the regional dynamics associated with them.
How low do you think they're going to allow these prices to go, and what does that mean here?
Sure. I think at this point, it's really a distraction to think about OPEC as a collective organization that is going to band together as it did in the 70s and change the oil price. I think the place to really look is Saudi Arabia. What is going to influence Saudi's decision? And right now, they're fairly comfortable waiting to see how the low price settles out, how different countries react to it. I think, this morning, the price is 69 for Brent. And I think if it goes considerably lower than that, the Saudis will start to get nervous about the possibility of political instability in the Gulf, which is actually something that the Arab Spring has not brought political instability to the Gulf. And if low oil prices threaten the ability of Gulf states to maintain their high levels of spending, then I think Saudi Arabia might take some action. But I wouldn't expect anything anytime soon.
And then we'll see how powerful.
I agree with both Julie and Richard that the new president is going to face an international environment that has experienced some pretty substantial structural changes over the last decade or so. And I'll just mention a few. The first is the risk of great power conflict. Now, this is a new dimension. This is the lack of the potential for great power conflict has been what really distinguished the post-Cold War world from the previous decades or even centuries. And suddenly, seemingly overnight, it's a very real threat or a very real possibility to be managed. Secondly, I'd say this new president is going to face the reality that the nation state has broken down in the Middle East, and that is a huge change to the structural system, and a lot will flow from that. Third, and this I'm less 100% sure on, but I think there's a possibility that one of the structural changes that this new president will face in the international environment is stalled globalization. We've all taken globalization, increasing integration, economic interaction as almost a given over the last couple of decades. And we see a lot of signs that there are hiccups or potentially larger obstacles in the way of globalization, whether it's in Europe from anti-immigration, anti-EU parties, whether it has to do with nervousness over trade. There's a whole variety of things. And lastly, just because I don't want to be all negative here, lastly, there is the reality of the new energy abundance. And that affects a lot of countries, but it certainly has changed the strategic landscape for the United States in a very substantial way. As we're all in this room aware, one of America's largest strategic vulnerabilities used to be its overwhelming dependence on external energy. And that has changed very, very dramatically, as we're well aware, and we have yet to really figure out how to capitalize on that in a strategic sense, but that will be something that the new president can certainly take advantage of.
So please join me in welcoming Dr. O'Sullivan to the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lynn, for that introduction. I have grand plans for our hour together. I am hoping to change how you look at the world. Now, is that ambitious? Yes. Is it doable? I think so. In particular, I want to change how you look at foreign policy. If I asked, what are the big drivers of foreign affairs? You might say to me, sectarian identities, historical animosities, geographic proximity, comparative economic advantage. You might say those are the things that drive alliances, wars, or other relationships between states. What I want you to do is put energy on that list. And I confess I want you to put it on the top of that list, or pretty close.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for that. It's always good to get a response back. I'm good. Excellent. We have a live crowd, which is great because we have a great discussion ahead of us. I'm Meghan O'Sullivan. I'm a professor at Harvard University, and I work at Harvard primarily on the geopolitics of energy. Thank you for joining us this morning for a conversation about the remarkable changes that have happened in the energy sector just in the last few years. If you had told me 5 years ago that there was going to be a revolution in energy, I probably would have guessed that it would be in the renewable sector. And certainly renewables have done reasonably well over the last few years, but one of the real energy revolutions has been in the oil and gas sector. If you look just at American production over the last few years, you see that in oil, over the last few years, America is producing more than 2 million barrels a day extra than it was compared to 2010, say. If you look at gas, the numbers are even more dramatic, where America in about 5 years' time has changed from looking at a future of importing natural gas to now a situation where one of the biggest debates in Washington is actually about whether and to what extent America should export natural gas.
I would also say, I mentioned up front, that in the last 15, 20 years, the drive for energy has really been the common factor in Chinese foreign policy. That many people say if China had its way, it would just focus on internal problems, that it wouldn't be a global power, and maybe for the next 10 or 20 years, that China would just focus on issues inside its borders. But it can't do that because it needs growth, and that growth is fueled by energy, and that energy has to come, at least in large part, from outside of China's borders. So this need and this drive for energy to support growth has pushed China into the world. So again, as I mentioned, it probably has been the defining feature of Chinese foreign policy, this pursuit of energy. But now the Chinese can look at the global energy environment. It's no longer one of scarcity. So literally, if I were here speaking to you 10 years ago, it's very plausible that I would be speaking to you about the potential for US-China conflict over the pursuit of scarce resources. That was one of the big conversations within the foreign policy group that I often interact with. It certainly was the focus of Pentagon reports and strategies and plans. Those conversations are like a thing of the movies. They don't happen anymore because people are looking at the new energy abundant world. And China is still concerned about getting that energy, but it's not concerned about having to beat out others in order to get it. And it's a lot more comfortable in relying upon the market to deliver energy rather than on a need to shape its foreign policy in a way to get energy through non-market means. So what does this mean in practice? I think we're going to see it. It's just beginning to unfold. But I think it gives China the opportunity to refashion its relationship with other parts of the world where energy is important, but not the only factor that matters. And so you're probably aware of China's relationship with Africa and how energy has been such a critical part of this. I think China has the opportunity to really, again, rebuild a different kind of relationship with Africa, one that may be more equal and one that may be more sustainable. And that's not just true for Africa, but it's for other parts of the world. And it taps into Xi Jinping's desire to fulfill this vision that he's calling a One Belt, One Road strategy.
So my next guests, two distinguished former American officials, were invited to Belfast last year. Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations and Meghan O'Sullivan of Harvard's Kennedy School spent 6 months with the parties trying to broker a compromise. They did not get the broad agreement they were hoping for, but they did learn quite a bit about negotiations and about making peace. But you didn't have any power. Did that matter? I mean, you were not, representing the United States government or the EU or something.
certainly we had limited levers to pull. And I think that did play a factor in how much we were able to persuade. We basically had our own powers of persuasion, and what we sought intentionally to do was to bring in the public. We recognized early on that if we just focused on the 5 parties who are our official negotiating partners, that we wouldn't be able to do this. So we spent the first several months actually meeting with the wider public, meeting with civil society. We met over 500 people in 100 meetings, and that actually catalyzed a public debate that, you know, others had been contributing to for a long time. We were not the only ones, but it really gave us, I think, more influence than we might have had we conducted everything behind closed doors.
I agree with that completely, and I would say we need to look at this a development on the part of Russia beyond simply the context of the Syrian conflict, which for all the reasons Anne-Marie suggested, we need more forceful action. But we need to see this move in the context of what it means in the broader region. This is about the United States in some large part. This is the most serious and direct challenge to America's global position in decades. And the United States needs to see it in that context, and it needs to see this as Russia's beginning move to try to establish
Russia, as the president said, acting out of weakness?
I do not see that. I don't agree with the assessment that I've heard from the administration that this is going to necessarily or inevitably work out badly for Russia. That's possible, but that's certainly not a conclusion that we can come to at this point. And to assume that this initiative is going to collapse on its own weight is to really disregard an important strategic moment that demands an American response along the lines that Anne-Marie mentioned.
I think there's structural change that we've seen over the last few decades, and that has to do with just the complexity of the world and the complexity of the foreign policy issues. I've heard Brent Scowcroft say decades ago there was one big issue, and that was the Cold War, and we'd studied it for a long time, and it moved relatively slowly. Today, the NSC is grappling with a large number of issues, many of them volatile, and so as a result, you have a larger and more hierarchical NSC than you have had in the past.